is happening. So please take a look at that, especially in this moment as we talk about abolition and what that means. I think this is such an important, I think it was like a stepping stone for me to understand, like, what? And so there's questions about that, please raise that. Megan Redshirt Shaw, one of our grad students who's part of this project, I just want to, shout out that brief, Beyond the Land Acknowledgement, Land Back or Free Tuition for Native Students. I absolutely love this brief, Megan, as this is co-sponsored. One of the partners for this project is Colorado State University, a land grant university that has, in the last couple of years, started to reckon with that history of destruction and genocide of Native peoples. And so, I felt this brief was so important that we're seeing a lot of our organizations come forward with land acknowledgements. But, are those just words? What does that mean in terms of tangible actions and healing, really? And so please take a look at that as well. So there's just fabulous briefs here. Dr. Thornhill's brief, Communication Equity Audits, Eliminating Racialized Responsiveness Among College Admissions Counselors. When that brief draft came through, I reached out to Marie immediately and I was like, Marie, I feel like admissions staff are not gonna, and some people are gonna feel some kind of way about this equity audit idea. It's just, I think it's just a provocative, really an important and provocative idea to really push the envelope around collective accountability around equity. So thank you, Dr. Thornhill, for that brief. Dr. Horton's brief on reimagining college fairs for equity. I really appreciate especially the kind of a checklist at the end of the brief that really kind of outlines things to think about for college fairs, not just pre or post, whatever post-pandemic looks like, but also considering this moment as well, because we don't know how long this is going to be, the distance necessity. And so really thinking through key ideas and considerations for diverse populations. Let's see, did I cover most or all? Oh, did I say something about the equity ratings? Maybe my voice was in and out. So Dr. Federick knows equity rankings, policy and practice brief, and alternative assessment to U.S. higher education. One of the things that kept coming up at the convening in November was the U.S. News rankings. And Akil may have some thoughts about that. We've gone back and forth on Twitter a little bit about that, but there's no doubt that research has shown how the U.S. News rankings has become kind of a prestige manufacturer. That this is very socially constructed and that it does, in fact, can shape institutional leadership decision making. But the problem with those rankings is that equity is certainly not clearly centered or central. And so Dr. No really provides some really great thought-provoking moments in that brief where I loved the voice in that brief, Federick, and just also, especially the reminder, kind of a side note reminder, hey, guess what? Most students don't actually attend these top 50 colleges and universities that U.S. News talks about as well. So thank you so much for that reminder that I think really needs to be said today as well, especially when we're talking about Gates and what Gates invokes around selectivity. Why selectivity? Why, I guess I haven't talked about my own brief. So I kind of take my own brief with, where was my ending the Hunger Games? I can't even remember the title of my own brief. So in many ways, right, I think selectivity. Really, we need to question this culture of selectivity and prestige. And so my own brief is about ending the Hunger Games that happens, this culture of the Hunger Games that is just absurd, both inside the prisons and, you know, as Dr. Corbett talks about, but also just generally in our quote unquote free society, right? So it's just really, my brief really, John Bockenstedt has talked about this for many years, this idea of a match system. I use the short brief to kind of explore that possibility. I dug into some research about the medical residency match programs, dug into some research around the UCAS system in Britain, which is kind of like the Common App on steroids, really. And so taking research from both of those systems and thinking through the legal questions around antitrust laws. I am not a lawyer, I will say that as well. I just hang out with a lot of lawyers. And so I have several footnotes reminding people I'm not a lawyer, but here's how the medical residency match worked around antitrust laws. I don't know if that's what we actually want to do, but it's something, you know, really, I think my intention in that brief is really just to be thought-provoking and to really think outside the box. Because I think at this moment, especially with the pandemic, as I am watching as we're about to start school year, my daughter's about to start kindergarten. I mean, we just need a complete overhaul, rethinking of a lot of our educational systems. And so I hope collectively these 8 briefs really help and push people to think broadly and really in big ways. And there's Doug again. I don't know what I'm going to do without Doug, my GA, dismantling the Hunger Games, exploring a match system in selective admissions. Thank you, Doug. Always keeping me on point. And Eileen, oh my gosh. Okay, so that's all I will say about the briefs. You can take a look at them. They are anywhere between 4-minute and 8-minute reads, especially for these busy practitioners out there. It won't take very long for you to read. I do want to do a quick shout out to the practitioner reviewers who also read through drafts of the brief and helping the research authors revise their briefs. And so big shout out to those folks. Marie, I don't know if you have that list of folks at hand with you, but no. But you know who you are. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it back to Marie.
Thanks. We have someone, Fiona Reese has raised her hand. So I'm going to, Fiona, got a question, go. Fiona?
Sorry, I was trying to figure out how to unmute myself.
There you go. What's your question?
Well, and I can read the brief, but I went to high school in the UK. And so I'm familiar with the UCAS, and I have been saying for years, I wish that we as a system would go to that there's no monetary system. The Common App isn't going to limit the number of applications because that's not against their best interests. Universities, as long as rankings are tied to the number of applications and your selectivity, there's no incentive for universities to do that. And I've actually talked about this, and a couple of people said to me, that's very un-American of you. We will never do this. And so I would love to hear sort of your perspectives. If the answer is go read the brief, then that is totally okay too. But I'm fascinated by this.
Oyan, you're on mute. Oyan, it seems like your sound might have finally died. Oi, how about this? Oyan, why don't you log out and restart your computer and see if that helps? And we'll go from there. Okay. Fiona, I'm not going to try to speak about Oyan's research with this. I will just share some of the conversations that we had as she was really kind of teasing out this idea that, yeah, this is really un-American, but that also led to a very, very different conversation of what is American and admissions, and that took us down a different tangent. Questions like, if, you know, is it too test score focused with the UCAS system? As we were talking about the match, she pointed out that there had to be, you know, an act of Congress for that to occur. And so how is that, you know, how are we going to be able to approach that? So it's just an idea, and it's one that I think she dives into really well, but just to acknowledge from the very beginning, as we kind of, as she was teasing out this idea, there were immediate questions right away about equity and how are these things going to play out possibly. One question, how do we adequately assess equity measures moving forward when we have so many competing goals? And this question is for any of the researchers. Yeah, and this was something I actually was speaking with a person who is a consultant for colleges, and that was, you know, their real question as well. How do you, how do we have all these competing things, and how do we make sure that equity stays at the center with all this very fast moving? So any of our researchers want to dive into that one?
So I'll pop in briefly. Hey,
is your puppy going to pop in too?
He is currently laying on my laptop. So if all of a sudden the escape button is pressed, don't know. I'll just restart. But I think, you know, and I'm answering this question kind of from my very niche perspective of working with incarcerated populations, where one would think, you know, when we analyze the demographics of people who are incarcerated, knowing that most of the folks who are incarcerated are people of color, Black and brown folks, that we're seeing these increased rates of incarceration for women. And so thinking about how we talk about, think about equity for access for women who are incarcerated, because they are often ignored or dismissed, or, you know, maybe one school will have this like hyper gender rolled program, like learn how to be, you know, a secretary, or, you know, some other such role that we stereotypically imagine for women. And so we need to kind of tackle that in this space. I think for the broader kind of incarcerated space, there is a tendency in some instances, despite the fact that there are mostly people of color who are incarcerated, college classes can be very white. And so, right, like how are we looking at the people who are in kind of our universe of interest, and how do we make sure that we are attending to the kind of equity needs around race and ethnicity, around security level, right? There are more education programs and more access opportunities in lower security facilities than there are in higher security facilities, because people want to see recidivism and they want to see, you know, who's going back, and you can't do that necessarily with someone who's got 15 years left on a 40-year sentence. So I think practitioners in this space have to do a lot of like personal work, quite honestly, first, to figure out where they are coming from, and also is where they are coming from aligned with where their institution is coming from in terms of wanting to offer these programs. Are schools offering these programs just to pat themselves on the back and say, look at how I'm helping all of the brown people? Or is the school coming to this space saying education is a human right? It is something that everyone is entitled to, and we are going to make sure that we have as much access as possible.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in with that one? Because if not, I have a follow-up question.
One thing I do want to point out, I don't know that I have a specific answer to that question, but I think the question of equity in all of these policies, I think it's important to consider that many people in these conversations talk about what creates more inequity than what other policies. Like often I hear it around testing, right? Getting rid of testing would be worse than this other thing, but there are no measures for that. So I would invite many people to, before you argue about what is more inequitable than what else, that you actually try to quantify that, right? You can't tell me testing is not as inequitable as GPA if you can't quantify the inequity created by GPA. So I think one of the important parts of this conversation is many of these inequities can't be quantified. How do we quantify, or have not yet been clearly quantified in a way that allows us to actually compare them. How do we quantify the damage done by legacy when Black people have pretty much only been allowed into college in the 60s, right? Like, how do we quantify the damage done generationally by that versus the damage done by test scores? So anyone who offers me the, oh, this is worse than that, I think is just, it's poorly reasoned arguing, because it's offering to compare things that actually have yet to be created in such a way that they're comparable. And so I think the whole conversation around competing, it feels like the inequity Olympics, right? like how are we actually going to compare these very, very different things and say which one is better, which one is worse? I just don't think it's a reasonable conversation at this point, because nothing has been done to make those things actually comparable. So I just wanted to throw that in the mix of these conversations.
Thank you. Any of the panelists want to respond or have thoughts about that? Frederick, I'm actually really curious how your equity ratings proposal addresses some of the issues that Akil is bringing up.
Yeah, I think for me, and so I'm really more of a community college and higher education policy scholar, and I had never really done research on college rankings before, but what inspired me was all the research being done by higher education researchers, and I just kind of pulled from their ideas in thinking about an alternative ranking system. I have to admit, when we started writing these briefs, because before the pandemic, I was really nervous about putting this out there. I was thinking like, oh my gosh, the econ of ed people are gonna like destroy this and think this is the most unrealistic thing ever. But actually, once the pandemic hit, I realized, this really is like a moment to look forward instead of looking back. And so really the idea for the brief is, as Oyan said, centering what types of metrics we want to see in higher education. So really try to think, not be limited by the practicality of using certain measures, but really more like what goal can we set for higher education so that higher education can change? Really the main idea behind the brief is the college rankings are very good at getting colleges to actually change and orient their behavior towards maximizing prestige. And so why not reorient them towards these more social justice and equity ideals? And so I outline, I think, 10 to 15 different areas. And I see a question in the chat that's, should it replace or should it augment? That would be up to all of us really to decide how much we want it to shift. I'm just offering the idea that rankings can get organizations to change more effectively than some of our other strategies, because they all want to be the best. Let's get them to be the best at a certain set of equity ideas.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and thanks for those questions that got us there. I have one really quick question, just to go back to Aaron really quick. You had mentioned, you're talking about the demographics and the prison population, and that we have these selective programs. And I have to acknowledge my alma mater, Washington U, is very proud of their program. And I was very proud of their program until I read your paper and learned more about the program, and then had many raised eyebrows. As I was thinking about that and thinking about your comment just then about the demographics, do those selective college programs have more white people in them in prison? Like, are they skimming in that way as well in those spaces?
So from what I have seen, in my program, because we overlap with the local highly selective institution in the state of Connecticut, I haven't seen in that program, more white students. But what we did see, and students reflected on, is kind of the suppressing impact that the elite admission process kind of had on people who were thinking about enrolling or thinking about applying. And so when you hear this university saying, you know, we want to do this interview, write these essays, take this test and do this and jump through all of these hoops, people were like, I'm good. I'll just, you know, I'll do the rest of my 30 and not, you know, go through all of this other. And so what it does is it creams certainly those who are probably stronger writers, which means that they either have taught themselves while they've been incarcerated, or they came into the facility with a certain set of skills, a certain knowledge base that will help them in these more traditional college settings. What I have seen in some other programs that I've been able to visit is that there are more white students because they're using these practices, right? The same practices that we see in free world colleges that advantage white students, high income students, et cetera, are the same ones in those states where the percentages, the demographic percentages might be a little bit more equal. That is part of what yields more white students that have perhaps come from more privileged backgrounds than other students who might need more help with access.
Thank you. I jotted down a million follow-up questions, but I won't bother. Thank you for that. One question that's in the Q&A is, how much did the hackathon or feedback from practitioners inform the policy papers? And that was certainly one of my goals from the very beginning of this, right? It's like, how can we all work together in these conversations more? So open that to the folks on the panel. Did attending the Hack the Gates or your feedback from the professionals, how did that impact or change how you approach this?
I know for myself, when thinking back to that meeting in November, like, I think one thing that I saw as I was floating from group to group was that we weren't talking about college fairs as much. It wasn't a central thing. We're focusing on, once the students transitioned in, how we can like refund them, how we can do outreach differently. And it was more like on the individual admission officer versus like the college fair specifically, on what the college fair can do to provide like workshops or opportunities, or even just a different infrastructure within the college fair workshops. So there's that one part. And then the second part on the feedback that I received, like the practitioner feedback, it really helped me push and to think differently on like, you know, what would this really look like in a high school in Nevada or a high school in Arizona, you know, wherever, like what would these practices and how we can like really try to change things on the second, like on the high school side, but also in post-secondary ed. Like what are little things that higher ed can do differently to really even send out the personnel that they do to different high schools in California or in the Midwest or the East Coast. And that really started like pushing me to think like, well, if we know we're going to like these high schools in rural California, are they going to have like an awareness of, you know, the recent immigrant population, whether it's Latino or you know, Asian Pacific Islanders or whoever is in that community? Like, are these admissions reps going to have like a cultural awareness and understanding of how to engage families in a way that they'll understand like the cultural nuances? So I think the practitioners really helped me to push and really think through those pieces. So it was critical for me. So thank you.
Anyone else want to jump in?
I want to take this moment to check my sound. Nope. Yes, nope.
I'll also jump in a little bit on the other part, because for me, it's interesting. I'm the only non-budding PhD in the group. So one, I'm
Me and you, dude. That's it. Just me and you.
But I'm on a paper, man. That makes me feel, woo. But, you know, I think what was interesting to me and being at the Hack the Gate gathering was the perspective shift, right? The perspective of admissions officers, I've been in test prep forever. So I was literally on the ground helping students prepare for the exams, and the perspective of policy and admissions side of the equation was something that I didn't have as much experience in. And in writing the paper, and since the convening, or over the last few years, having a greater experience and exposure to the admissions perspective has been really interesting. You know, I think one of the things that we didn't get a chance to dig into in this paper, but I'm exploring, is how test optional policies will play out at various levels of selectivities of institutions. And how do we clarify the varying uses of tests across institutions? Because unfortunately, and this is sort of tied to the ranking conversations, right? You know, tests in and of themselves, and we got into a little bit of this, Oyan, tests in and of themselves in US News ranking may be, you know, somewhere between 7.5 and maybe 15% of the actual ranking, right? But it dominates the conversation. There's the narrative that changing your test average is going to skyrocket your US News ranking, and it's just not true, right? I was speaking to an admissions officer who was stunned by the percentage of the ranking that they could actually implement or impact in their office. So how does these policies change across selectivity levels of institutions? And that is an ongoing exploration and conversation, I think, that we're continuing to have, that writing these papers and having these conversations will continue to make for better, more nuanced conversations that go beyond the needs and wants of the standards of the world, right? And I think that that's really important. You're muted, Marie.
It's like I've never done this before, or that I won't be doing this 4 more times today. One question that came up in the chat for Jennifer and Taylor regarding the direct admissions program that Idaho has implemented that you all have studied. Do you know if other states are actively considering that? As something you can share, if any other states are looking at that program?
Yeah, so I'll just, if people haven't read the brief yet, the idea with direct admissions is to really have a universal low-cost policy to simplify admissions within a state, and to use existing state longitudinal data systems to proactively admit students to college. So instead of having each individual do their own search and relying on college fairs and all these things, both Idaho and South Dakota have functioning direct admission systems in place that also use common applications. So students in high school just get sent letters that says, congratulations, you've been admitted to this following list of colleges. And those letters go to students. It also goes to parents and to their high schools, so that there's some responsible adults in the students' lives saying, yes, this is real, you've been admitted. There have been, you know, PBS campaigns and all sorts of stuff that go along with it as well. But in terms, like, if I can just bounce back to that first question about equity, we really think something that's universal, where all students are treated equally, and we don't need students to rely on extensive social and cultural capital in order to navigate what can be a very complicated college admissions process, has the potential really to increase equity across the system and reduce some gaps with groups that have been under participating or not participating at the levels that we'd like in post-secondary education. So that got me a little off kilter here. What was your, I've lost the chat. What was the specific question, Marie?
Are there other states that are actively considering? Are you aware this is something that folks are actively engaging with in terms of policy that could occur? Yeah, so there's definitely been a lot of interest across the country in terms of thinking both about statewide common application systems, system-wide common application systems, maybe some expansion of the private nonprofit Common App, and then also direct admission systems. So as scholars, we've been able to work with folks in Texas and Georgia and Hawaii. Minnesota, I think, has some interest there. I think there's interest in Idaho and perhaps expanding there in light of the pandemic, looking at test optional for the fall. So there's some innovation that may be coupled with the direct admissions. There's interest in South Dakota, likewise, in sort of thinking through their system, and can we use direct admissions as a tool for bringing other policies like application fee waivers or test optional or financial aid into a system to really increase those equity goals. I'm based at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. We had a bill introduced in February to put forth a common application
and direct admission system here. So there's interest. It didn't go anywhere with the pandemic, but I think we're seeing these little pots of interest pop up across the country. And it's been really helpful for us as scholars to be able to disseminate the idea, but also to bring practitioners and policymakers in different states together. So there may be others. I think I didn't mention Utah. There was interest there as well, but there may be others. And it's there if you're in a place that has interest or in a system that has interest in thinking about something like this. We're very open to talking about that. Obviously, we've got early results out of Idaho that we can share, but it's really promising, and it's really what were the words you used, Marie? Game changing, and thinking about really changing how we think about admissions and making it less about search and more about match and what's best for students.
Thank you. Thank you. Megan Redshirt Shaw, there's a lot of questions for you in the Q&A of folks saying, yeah, this idea of of critiquing the land acknowledgement and pushing it further, making it real and tangible. And then the follow-up question of, and I'm not the boss, like, how can I do this? How can I impact that change? So Megan, do you have some thoughts about how to push your idea forward in big ways?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I've really observed, especially with sort of this resurgence of acknowledging land and acknowledging labor as well, I want to say that I am starting to sort of examine. I was part of a conference recently and they did a land and labor acknowledgement, and I thought that was really powerful. A lot of times when I'm sitting in a land acknowledgement, I feel sort of this emptiness. I feel like it still is pushing this narrative that Indigenous people don't exist, or that Native students don't have a say or don't have a space. And this particular land and labor acknowledgement that I heard was really powerful because it also acknowledged what Indigenous and Black people, the work that they put forward in actually creating systems of higher education and the lives that were lost. And so I thought that that was a really powerful kind of narrative. And so I think for me, I am starting to feel a little bit uncomfortable that many conferences or large events, they acknowledge the land and then there's no sort of further acknowledgement of Native student experiences or occupation of their homelands or the loss of learning that's happened for Native students. Our systems of knowledge are based on land and relationships to land. And so by institutions occupying that land, we can't teach our students traditional methods of language and plants and medicine and healing. And so in this brief, just sort of really challenging higher education to think that, to think forward in not only just saying this land acknowledgement, but how can we actually make tangible action for Native students to make them feel like they're being understood, that these are their traditional homelands. And especially, I was actually glad to hear Jennifer talk about South Dakota. I'm based in South Dakota. We have 9 tribally federally recognized nations here. And many of the students are attending institutions that are on their traditional homelands. And one of the programs that I talked about, and all of this is really extended from a report, I really encourage everybody to read it. I'll put it in the chat, called Land Grab Universities, that was put out by High Country News. If your institution benefits from the Moral Act, especially, please read that report and see how much land was lost by these nations and by these people. So I saw that Nikki had a question, and Nikki was one of many people who really supported me in this brief. So Nikki, thank you for the long phone call that we had where I was really sort of reflecting on how to move this forward. Also Dr. Delphine Redshirt, Dr. Amanda Ticini, Dr. John Little, and of course, Dr. Poonen Marie, who gave me a tremendous amount of feedback on all of this. I'm really appreciative. And this is the work of many, many Indigenous people. So I just want to acknowledge that as well. Like, this is very, very far extended. But I think that just for you to start thinking about within your offices, are we not recruiting Native students because we don't have a Native recruiter? Because I see that happen all the time. I see people say, we're only going to look at Native students if we have somebody who's Native within the office. A lot of Native people I know feel this pressure to, and it's like a diversity committee for any sort of underrepresented group. We need to start pushing the work to everybody in these offices. Everybody in admissions offices need to be recruiting BIPOC students, first generation students, low income students. We need to fall away from this idea of like, we need a designated person to do this. Our students are waiting for you. They're waiting for your college to come. Here in South Dakota, many of our students, they don't even know that your college exists. I know there are budget issues. I know we're flyover country, but please start coming to our states, commit to spaces where there are high populations of Native students. And if you can't give back the land, think about ways that you can, sort of benefit students in their journey. My research is going to be on financial aid. I know one of the flyers said I was a PhD. I'm not there yet. I'm just a student. I hope that my dissertation will be focused on financial aid and Native students and some form of this sort of land-based reparations concept. But I am, happy to be in further discussion with people or connect you to other really fantastic Native scholars who are doing this work, and other people who I know are leading in the field as well.
Thank you. We want to have one last, I'm sorry, go ahead, Adrian, go ahead.
Build on what Megan just shared, and something that I was thinking, I saw one of the questions about not like overworking like people of color, especially with the recruiting process. And I think sometimes colleges ignore the fact that students of color and first-gen students are active recruiters, are doing student programming, are academic advisors. They've been doing all this work on your campuses for 3, 4, or 5 years for free. And it's like, how often do those admission reps go to the various student organizations on campus and saying, let me hire you as a student worker. Let me do this. Let me, there's different ways that admission offices and enrollment management can engage all these students on campus and compensate them for all the free labor they've been doing for years. And, especially thinking about all the academic advising, like how often do students ignore their academic advisor because they had a racialized experience or a discriminatory experience and go to their peers to figure out what classes to take or what instructors to avoid, or whatever context of your institution. So I think that's really an opportunity to, if you're trying to recruit and diversify your admission staff, then focus on the undergrads you have, but compensate them for their time. Don't say, oh, here's a paraprofessional opportunity for you. Say, here's a paid opportunity for you to help represent our university, and and give them training and allow them to shadow and start teaching them these things. So hopefully they do decide to go maybe explore the option of a career in higher ed. But it really takes that first step on our institutions to recognize that, that we haven't seen the labor or acknowledge all the labor that all these students have done for decades. So I just want to throw that out there.
Thank you. It's really important. Thank you. We are very slightly touched over time, but I want to wrap up by giving each of the panelists just like one wrap up thoughts. But I wanted to start with Dominique and Ted, since we didn't hear from you during this, and I'm so sorry about that because y'all are fucking awesome. So Dominique, why don't you, start us off with like wrap ups, and then Ted, and then everyone else can jump in.
Sure, it's not a problem at all. Plus, my husband decided to start the dishwasher for some reason in the middle of this. So, you're gonna hear a slight rumble. Go with it. He'll receive. Oh, yeah, I know you're sorry. He just walked by. So that's part of the reason that I've been like, you know what? Someone already said what I was gonna say. It's fine. But and he stopped it. So no, I think I was incredibly excited to participate in this because it sort of blends multiple perspectives of my own personal lived experience, but also provides an opportunity to create sort of research-based policy suggestions, whether they're internal to an institution policy decisions, internal to a department, or thinking about from a state's perspective, the entire country, in a way that y'all have heard, provided an opportunity where practitioners, actual admissions professionals, could provide feedback and guidance and thoughts. Because I think often, we provide information from a research-based perspective that's like wholly disconnected from the ways that it would actually have to be implemented in order to make any sort of change work. And so I was just very excited by this opportunity. Y'all may have heard earlier that Akil mentioned he is one of the few bright spots here without a PhD or seeking on the journey toward a PhD. And that's because I said, Akil, I think you should write this with me. So, right, like I think it's incredibly important and powerful that we make sure that as researchers, as scholars, we use our skills along with other people's skills and knowledge to help imagine what could be. And so I was really excited to get a chance to do this. And I'm happy, as Akil inferred, right? Like there were several questions that we had that we were just like, it does not fit in the page limit that Dr. Poon gave us. And so we are going to follow the limits that we were told. But these are topics that matter and are being upended in some ways in the middle of a pandemic, as a lot of different institutions across the country are. And so my hope is that we can continue trying to think diligently about the way we can use what we know of evidence to create more humane and equitable experiences within the admissions process, while also involving the students who experience this and the professionals that do the admitting work, but also thinking about the sort of pressures that they are under and the power that they do and don't have as well.
Thank you. Thank you. On a side, and we'll have to talk about this later, Love Island, UK. Ted.
Hello. Well, I'd just like to thank you and Oyan for allowing me to be involved in this important project. And I guess I would say that my thoughts are that everything that we've discussed are all, and the possibilities that exist as a result, are all contingent on the personnel employed in these admissions positions. And so while there are a number of people that have signed up to participate in this webinar, and there are some additional folks, many folks part of ACCEPT, that are willing to do the difficult work, I think that a lot of this has to do with hiring, and that is racial inequities, because a lot of the problems that are addressed in these policy briefs are a function of racism existing and thriving in admissions offices and on their campuses more broadly. So to the extent that folks feel a little like disempowered because perhaps they don't have tenure or they're junior level professionals, I mean, you gotta, there's gonna have to be risks. You can't take it all. I continue to say this every time I have an opportunity, but without some skin in the game, I mean, you might have to put yourself out there. I know a lot of institutions have BFSAs, Black Faculty Staff Associations, Latinx staff and faculty associations, et cetera. I would suggest that folks align themselves with these organizations. So if you don't have significant formal institutional power, there are other ways to acquire power indirectly, formal and otherwise, that will make it more difficult for these racist senior admissions administrators and others who would seek to have you removed from the institution because you're advocating for greater justice. So I think it can be very empowering to do that. I feel awfully good every time I talk about these matters and I call out folks, whether it's in admissions or another institution in our society beyond higher ed. So that would be my advice to folks. And there's a lot of data that exists. Don't only focus on the student data. There's a lot of data that exists within admissions offices that's actually in the offices. Like my proposal, I talked about auditing folks' email practices. And I know a lot of folks probably don't like that idea, but look, if you're not discriminating against students, you don't got nothing to worry about. So if you respond equitably to all the email inquiries from prospective students, students who have applied, students who have just recently been admitted, then you don't have nothing to worry about. And nobody's going to terminate you for a fractional difference in the responsiveness to one group or another. We're looking for systemic patterns, sustained patterns of your indifference to the lives and careers and goals of students of color. So I think folks that are a little timid just need to realize the moment we're in, and particularly over the last couple of months in the wake of the execution of George Floyd, and just be about it. You know, there are, especially those of you who are of color too. I mean, yeah, it's a burden, but other people, I'm thinking about John Lewis that passed away recently. I mean, it's just gonna take work. We're not to the point yet where all the white folks gonna do the work. We all gotta work together, and there's risk involved.
Thanks, Ted. Appreciate that. Taylor, why don't you chime in? We haven't heard from you. Your wrap-up thoughts.
So I think the only thing I would say is from the initial slide with Marie and Oyan's conversation about has there been like a radical rethinking of the college admissions process? I think a short answer is like no, but I think a promising answer is that there are some public policy solutions that can push us forward in that area. And research that Professor Delaney and I are doing, research that Dominique Baker Professor Baker and her colleagues are doing as well around lotteries and things like that. There are ways that states and researchers and organizations are thinking about these things. They're not going to be a panacea to correct like the long history of injustice in the college admissions and equity process, but they are a way for admissions officers, admissions counselors, researchers, and policymakers to link arms to make some incremental progress in this area. And so I think direct admissions is one way to do that. And I think a key way that policies like that have been advanced forward are one, listening to one another, those diverse stakeholder groups to augment policies and develop them in a way that serves everyone, but also in identifying the benefits that serve all of these groups. You know, when our admission system is more just, our communities and our workforce and everything else is drastically improved as well.
Thanks, Taylor. Let's see, Adrian, you're next on my screen.
Yes. Oh, you want me to talk about the brief?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just, you know, as we move this forward, you're like, what?
Oh, yeah. What's going on? Well, in thinking about the brief, and what I appreciate was Oyan pushing really like, okay, well, what about now during COVID, right? Like, so what is a college fair going to look like in the fall or in the spring with COVID? And that really pushed me to think like, well, what can, you know, local nonprofits do with regional college access groups that can work with school districts? Like, how can we find resources to create like, you know, 1 to 3 minute videos on different topics, right? Because students are still going to need help to apply to college. And students are still going to need help applying to FAFSA and all these other pieces, because as institutions across the country try to figure out what they're going to do, students are still going to need, like, students, families, and guardians are going to need that scaffolding to remember deadlines, to remember, you know, whether you're applying to this public institution or this private institution, all the different like hurdles that students have to get through in order to get there. So these 1 to 3 minute videos was a big piece. Post-COVID, even thinking about, you know, like the different types of workshops or digital workshops that you can provide students that they need to think about personal statements, even institution types, like the basic things that we talk about, us as researchers that we talk about every day that we just know. We can't expect a 10th grader or 11th grader to know the difference between an HSI, MSI, a private nonprofit versus a private for-profit. All these things, like students are going to know, oh, that school's close and it's cheap and I can get done fast, or I don't know if I can afford that institution because online it says 50,000, my parents make 42,000, so they're just going to opt out. So there's still so much things that we've, as a higher ed community, have been talking about for 20 years that we still haven't solved, and that families are still struggling to get over. So I would hope that in these workshops or in reimagining these college fairs, that we can really start pushing to provide different sessions and different information, and also providing it in even languages that parents and guardians can understand. And sometimes school districts, they're like, okay, well, we know we have a Latino population here, so we'll just send out some mailers, but there's also a, you know, an increase in the API community or the Asian American Pacific Islander community, and they don't get any information, even though they might represent 30% of the school district. So why aren't we putting it in multiple languages to make sure that family elders will be able to support their students and be connected? So as much as this is about pushing on college fairs, I think we still need to make big shifts, because school districts are still missing big populations of their communities that they haven't even tapped into. So those are like my big pieces, and in the checklist, I think it's like 2 pages long, 3 pages long, and just like basic things that I think sometimes people just overlook because they assume students will know. And like one thing I thought about recently too was even internships. Like, when is it too early to start talking to high school students about internships, whether they're paid or non-paid, or like how do you connect that to even thinking about majors? Because sometimes when you tell a student, oh, maybe you should study sociology, they're like, what's that? Or what do I do with ethnic studies? Or what do I do with this? And it's like sometimes we need to provide that scaffolding that students need and families and guardians need to understand the connections of a credential to other life opportunities in the future. So
Thank you.
yeah, those are some of the big things that I
No,
thought
those
about.
are key. Thank you. Let's see. Megan, you're next on my screen.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Oyan and Marie and all the generations of people who have envisioned these changes, and to all of the Indigenous and allies who worked hard to have land acknowledgements put into institutions of higher education in the first place, and particularly to our students who, you know, higher education for so many of our communities is such a massive challenge. And I just encourage all of us to continue to challenge each other on these issues. I'm really excited to read all of the policy briefs and to learn from the other scholars and advocates and allies that are here. And I think that if we stop challenging each other on these things, and we've stopped caring, and we've stopped pushing the narrative for our students. And so I just really want to thank this group and say that I'm always open for conversation or discussion or dialogue about any of these issues, and I look forward to learning from everybody as well.
Thank you. Akil, you're next. Wrap up thoughts.
I'm going to be quick. My wrap-up thoughts are, I encourage everyone in the admissions field, especially on the college end, if you require a thing, do the thing. I'd love to see faculty, admissions officers take the SAT, register for it, and then post your scores, right? I challenge you to do that. And then let's talk about the value of the test. I also warn colleges, especially those that are not highly selective, that there is a real world in which, if you are still requiring tests, there will be 30% or less of the SATs and ACTs administered this year than there were last year. So your applicant pool will be decimated if you continue to require the test. So please just consider those two things.
Repeat that first line again. If you need it, do it, because it's going to be my next tattoo. So I want to make sure I get it right.
If you need a thing, do the thing.
If you need a thing, do the thing. That's
and
damn
I
good.
find it
Ted's
fascinating.
writing it down.
Right. I find it fascinating, like when you think adults who go, no, I would never take the test, but you want kids to do it. Like, let's just full stop right there. Like, done.
I took an acuplacer test once, and I'm just gonna say that out loud, and then I'm gonna put myself back on mute.
No. Now you get to go. Okay, but you have to tell us the puppy's name, because
I want to thank Akil for saying that, because I don't want to talk about my acuplacer scores, but suffice it to say, I don't know math. So, sort of concluding thoughts, I want to, echo what a lot of other folks are saying, the thanks for thinking about incarcerated populations. It's really easy to overlook the students that we work with. It's very much kind of out of sight, out of mind for many people in many schools. And so we're just super thankful to be involved in this conversation. And I want to just kind of personally thank Oyan for pushing me sort of beyond the kind of the diplomatic academic approach and tone that I had, because she knows me and knows that I'm reckless, and so I could look at the track changes and she's like, add more shade here. And so it was just being kind of free to have the opportunity to really say what I was thinking. I think that highly selective admission processes in prisons are trash. There's no need for them. Why do we have them? Stop doing them. And my first draft was like, maybe if we think about how this could maybe be bad a little bit. And Oyan was like, nah, we're not doing that. So the kind of freedom that she and other reviewers were able to give me, to kind of give me that freedom and opportunity, is the same kind of freedom and opportunity that we want to be able to give students who are confined behind bars. We want to make sure that they are feeling like they are entitled to these educational opportunities, that they deserve these educational opportunities simply because they are human beings, not because they have jumped through 10,000 hoops to demonstrate their worth, right? Because when we have this process, you are essentially saying, a school is essentially saying, if we don't deem you worthy, then you are not worthy of this opportunity. And that's trash. So I just want to, again, thank everyone. I'm looking forward to reading all of the briefs. And thank you. And Caesar says thank you too.
Thank you. Such a sweet puppy. Frederick.
I think my final thought is, as I was writing the brief, I realized that a lot of the data are already available to add or augment the existing rankings, right? Like, you know, the work of like Ozan Jaquette and Karina Salazar, they have fascinating data on recruitment practices of higher ed institutions. We have data already collected on enrollment and graduation by race and class. We have information on prison and college programs and community college transfers. It's just that we have the main ranking systems don't care to include that kind of information. So really it's more about intention and choice than anything. I tried to write the brief such that it like to say that this is actually doable if we wanted to do it.
Thank you. Let's see, Jennifer.
So I'll just wrap up by thanking everyone for the opportunity and how nice it's been to connect with and get feedback from practitioners, but also to connect with each of the panelists and to see different people really thinking innovatively about college admissions and change that's possible. I think Dominique started with this, but I do think that there's value in having research practitioner partnerships and really thinking through what could be next and how we can reimagine the world as it is, because I think it's perfectly right to not be satisfied with how we do admissions in the US. And I love the idea of thinking about, you know, low cost universal options, things that inherently are going to help build access and equity for a variety of different student populations. So thank you for including us and making these opportunities available.
Thank you. Akil, you and I have the privilege of only having bachelor's degrees, so that's why we get to go last. Anything else that you want to?
No, I'm done. I think I said my bit.
Then I will take the privilege of this. Oyan, unfortunately, is still having sound problems, and we're going to talk about that later. I'm so honored just to be in this space with you all. I might have mentioned this to some of you before. I come from a family of academics, and I am not. And so to be with you all, to have these conversations was in many ways really familiar and almost family-like. So thank you. Thank you so much for including me and including Accept and including us practitioners, because I think that, as Jennifer and others pointed out, that to me has really been such an exciting moment about this, is really engaging in these conversations and saying, you know, how are you studying this? And have you thought about this way? And how are we looking at things incorrectly, or how could we do this different? So just every one of you, thank you so much. I've grown so much as a person, as a thinker, as a reformer maybe, just from knowing each of you. So thank you. And want to finish by thanking Dr. Oyan Poon and Samir Gadkari for making this happen. Those are two people who force of nature doesn't really describe either of them adequately enough. These are two people who make things happen. And for this to be Accept's first big project and to have it come up with, it's beyond exciting. And I'm just so grateful. And I'm thrilled that this happened. And as someone said to me the other day, and I think that was Oyan, this is the end of chapter 1 of Hack the Gates, but chapter 1 there's a lot that's going to come next. We're going to take these ideas, we're going to test drive these guys, we're going to get funding to see what we can make happen soon, right? And to anyone else out there who's doing this work, like, we want to keep working too. So thank you so much to everyone. Absolutely, thank you. We'll get this recording at ASAP once we get it captioned. I hope we continue working together. Oyan, anything you want to throw into the chat room that I can say for you or anything before we say goodbye? If not,
It's in the chat box. I wrote something.
we're going to get you that sound system fixed. Thank you to everyone who spent the time with us today. We appreciate you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. See you later. Take care.